Episode 195, Ward Vuillemot, Chief Product Officer, Chief Technology Officer, and an advisor to startups.
Mistakes are fundamentally the hallmark of growth in so many different ways, and even where innovation comes from.
I'm Mark Graban. This is My Favorite Mistake. In this podcast, you'll hear business leaders and other really interesting people talking about their favorite mistakes. Because we all make mistakes, but what matters is learning from our mistakes instead of repeating them over and over again. So this is the place for honest reflection and conversation, personal growth, and professional success. Visit our website at myfavoritemistakepodcast.com. To learn more about Ward, his work, and more, look for links in the show notes or go to markgraban.com/mistake195. As always, thanks for listening. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to My Favorite Mistake. Our guest today is Ward Vuillemot. He's a seasoned C-suite executive with over 6 years of experience leading fully remote teams while building tech organizations from the ground up for companies 150 to 650 employees in size and from revenue ranging from 50 to 125 million across the Americas and Europe. He's currently Chief Product Officer and CTO at RealSelf, and he's a technical advisor with his own company. His website is wardvuillemot.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Ward advises startup founders and CEOs on technical roadmaps and technology organizations, along with using what we call, sometimes referred to in this podcast, lean approaches to finding market signal quickly. So Ward, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me.
We'll give people the spelling here if they don't want to go seek the show notes. Ward, W-A-R-D, Vuillemot, VUILLEMOT.com. Very French, as we were discussing before we were.
Yes, very, very, very French, though we do not pronounce it like the French. So
more of a Washington Americanized pronunciation, where Ward's joining us today from Washington. And the reason I invited Ward here, we'll talk about this after his favorite mistake story. There was an article written about Ward in Forbes about what he calls COE, celebration of errors. So clearly we're in the right place to have a discussion about that. But before we talk about that concept and the article, as we do, I won't let you off the hook, Ward. Looking back at the different things that you've done, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
Yeah, I think I think your career, mistakes are fundamentally the hallmark of growth in so many different ways, and even where innovation comes from, which is something I've written about, ignorance and mistakes. That's how we learn. But if I think about I think the earliest one where I thought I knew the answer and I learned something along the way was a small startup program that we were doing out of Amazon. It was a sister program to Amazon Fresh. This was before Amazon Fresh went national, so we were still in the Seattle area, and I was a part of that. And I was asked to go over and help be part of the launch team for something called Amazon Tote. And just real briefly, Amazon Tote was the idea that you could get free deliveries to your home, any item on Amazon, and we would deliver it sort of like your best friend. You imagine if you called me up, Mark, and said, "Hey, Ward, could you go down to the mall and pick me up, an iPod at the time?" And I put it in a little tote bag and I dropped it off at your door, and, that's how you got it. So to getting rid of all the boxes, you just get these totes. So we got Amazon Tote. And I remember in the very beginning, we were working with Doug Harrington, and Doug Harrington really was into this, working backwards from the customer mindset, very much of that lean mindset. And, before we even wrote really any code, I had, I guess it's not a mistake, but just to give you an idea of how we were thinking about it, I'll get into the mistake. But I hacked his browser with his permission, to be clear. I hacked his browser, and he would go to the Amazon website, and it was Cheese Whiz or Cheez-Its, and he would order it and go through this, what we thought was going to be the launch experience. And then I would get an email based on that little hacked browser experience. And I would put the Cheez-Its in my bag, the tote bag, and, I'd walk down the hallway to his office, and I would deliver the Cheez-Its. We learned some really interesting things around having too little friction in the user experience, which was really fascinating to us. And I think to myself, we didn't really have an interstitial at that point. It was just too frictionless. So that's a really good, interesting learning from Amazon Tote was the lack of friction. You need some amount of friction. We always talk about reducing friction for consumer. There's such a thing as too little friction. Yeah. So that was a really important lesson. And again, lots of lessons in there. As I mentioned, like we didn't even really write code. We were just learning this just by doing some really, really, really low level, low fidelity mock-ups. But the one that I had done before launch was this idea of multi-quantity. So you could get multiple items. We had a cart like everyone else, but you could only order one. So let's just go back to that original example. Let's just say you wanted to buy an iPad or iPod for yourself and someone else. The way you would do it, the way we envisioned it, was that you would add the iPod to your tote bag, and then you would go back to the detail page and you would add it again. And this was to do with some ways that we were sort of quite literally hacking Amazon's inventory system. And we knew we could only guarantee a quantity of one at any one time when we put it in. We couldn't do a promissory of greater than that. And I did a bunch of research around consumer experience. We knew that generally consumers might buy multiple items, but not multiple quantities. So you could have an iPod and a book, but very, very improbable you would have two iPods and a book. So we knew that by not having that multi-quantity, at least from a consumer behavior standpoint, we weren't like missing out on opportunity. And so I felt very confident going to launch with this thing without this multi-quantity drop down. Right. So we launched that, and every week we meet with our customer support folks, and lo and behold, the number one complaint, as you can imagine because of the story, was where the F is your multi-quantity. Aren't you a bunch of effing idiots? Like they were not polite to us. Like
right. And aren't you Amazon, who should
be? Are you Amazon? How could you not have this thing? Right. So like every week, and I kept on going to the customer support. I'm like, hey, I got the data. It's not going to change behavior. We knew this. This is just the fringe, but it was like the number one complaint in terms of volume and even quantity, of no pun intended. So again, like I said, we were sort of hacking the inventory system because this was really much meant to be like this grand experiment in customer behavior. So, for me to put a multi-quantity drop down, I potentially had a race condition where you could ask for more than one item, and I might only deliver you less than what you asked in terms of quantity. So there was exposure to like the consumer experience on the other end, which is really hard to communicate via a website, right? So we did some more research. We finally sort of came up with a way that we felt like, okay, I think we can probably cover for the race condition, or at least we know how to dive and save for it. And again, I measured out before. I had really great data leading up to this launch as multi-quantity. We launched multi-quantity. Lo and behold, we went back, and do you know what happened?
What happened?
Nothing. Yeah. Nothing happened except for the complaint. The complaints went down. The consumer behavior did not change, but the complaints disappeared. So we did not open up, because there's some people hoping that somehow this was materially, magically going to change consumer behavior. But all the data, and we had reams and reams of data that wasn't it. And so it was just an interesting lesson for me about how, in the Amazon tote world, learned a lot about like too little, too much friction, right? We're always thinking to remove more friction, but there's such a thing as actually removing. So it's sort of that Goldilocks of friction. That was like lesson number one. Lesson number two is, there's a big gulf between quantitative and qualitative understanding of the customer experience. And if you really want to create the best experience, you need to have both, right? Because there was a subset of our customers who really looked down on us, who weren't happy with us. And it also created a lot of operational friction for our customer support folks too. Instead of being able to work on real problems, they were working on an optics problem, right, of constantly dealing with these upset customers. And so just recognizing that, I think there's a world where a lot of people get really into, reduce friction at all costs, and also let the data entirely drive itself. And that's the only thing that you should pay attention to. And I walked away from a more nuanced position of like, there's sort of the Goldilocks in everything. There is a right balance, and you have to look at a lot of different dimensions. Even when the answer is correct on one side of the equation, you have to look at other dimensions to really come back with a holistic view of the customer experience. And that was a really big epiphany and a big eye opener for me and which I've carried forward in how I think about the customer experience, and always working back is really carrying, multiple lenses along the journey.
Yeah. So, there's a lot to dig into, but I was going to ask, about the learning, right? Because we here in the podcast we try to emphasize we're not shaming anybody for making a mistake. We're celebrating the learning that comes from it. Can you think of a situation later on where you were reminded, hey, don't focus only on the quantitative data about the customer needs, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the quantitative, but the shaming and sort of, there's a greater bit to that too. And I'll share a slightly different story. I've written about it before, but it's about me and an ant, and it was a previous place of work. Happy to be wearing the hat there. I won't say it out loud, but mainly because that's not really about the story. It's not about them. It's just about me. But I was on this bus. I commuted every day, an hour and a half one way, so 3 hours a day kind of commute. And I'm not a kind of person who generally goes out of my way to kill insects, but I don't have a problem killing them. And I'm sitting on this bus and I see this ant and I have this moment of like, I'm not going to kill this ant, right? It's crawling down around by my toe. And I'm like, a little bit of karma maybe, and then I had another thought. It's like, I've been on this bus for 45 to 50 minutes. This ant probably came with me or someone else. It's not like this ant's going to get off this bus and go find a new nest and say, hey, I'm moving in. I mean, this ant's dead, right? Like it is effectively dead. It just doesn't know it's dead. It's just a matter of when, not if, because of the nature of ants, right? And
they've lost their
nest, their community, they're away from their people, as it were. Yeah. And then I had a moment of like, oh, this place I'm going to work is the same kind of way. Like I am dead. I am going to die because it was for me a very toxic environment, very aggressive, very sort of, you would go have coffee with a friend, like you and I could go have coffee, Mark. We'd go into a meeting, and next thing you know is you would open up a 12 gauge shotgun to me, in that meeting. And that was just sort of part of the course. You'd be like, hey, Mark, I thought we were on the same team. You'd be like, yeah, but I'm taking care of my career and you're in my way. And so it was sort of heralded as part of, actually as a hallmark of the culture. They really like that very aggressive culture. And as a person, a long journey of understanding that I'm a high functioning autistic person, and then furthermore recognizing that I operate in certain kinds of ways that are I have a very binary relationship with certain kinds of environments. I decided to change how I was behaving at work. In part, that's because I grew up in an environment where there was a sense of professional self versus personal self, right? And you hear that a lot at work. Like show up to work, present yourself in a certain you act in a way that is quote unquote, and I'm using quotes, professional. Right. That's sometimes very counter to your how you behave outside of work, right? And there should be some differences, right? But you get into this like, oh wow, like you're a loving, amazing human being, but inside of work, you are like you're a completely different person, like unrecognizable. That kind of difference.
I've seen that before. Yeah.
And what I found for myself, and this is sort of like that, Dan, it was like trying to ape those behaviors that I thought were quote unquote professional. So here is an environment that's very aggressive, very in your face, not how I want to reflect for myself. It's not how I want to act personally. And because I'm autistic, like acting in a way that's inconsistent for me is antonym to like basically doing personality suicide. Like I just couldn't handle it. So I showed up to work the next day after having this quite cathartic, literally crying on the bus with this ant, as crazy as that sounds. Like I had a moment of just crying. I don't think the ant actually cried, but I was crying on behalf of the ant myself. And I showed up to work, and one of the things that I'm I don't know, noted for, but like I try to be a very warm and caring person. And I would go into meetings sometimes and I would just look to the person to the left or the right, especially if I worked with them closely, and just say, I really appreciate you. Or, I could tell that they had a bad meeting, and I might just take a moment as we're at the meeting, just say, just know I love you. I care about you. And not something that most people would expect to find at work. And of course, it went about as well as you might expect it in the environment. A lot of people did not like it, or majority are probably indifferent. There's one or two who probably turned off. But what I found was there's a few people that really resonated with, and there were the people that I cared to work with the most. And that was like the other piece of this whole sort of mistake, as it were, is I followed a career based sort of on ego and chasing after the most interesting intellectual problems. But I also wasn't solving the other aspect of myself, which was the interpersonal connections that I needed at work that I was not looking for when I went and interviewed for companies. And so that was the moment, that was the epiphany, that was the pivot in my life where I started looking at my jobs and where I worked and who I worked with from a additional dimensions. Not just is it intellectually interesting, but are these people that I care about? Do they care about me? Are we solving a problem that I can sort of not just intellectually, but spiritually, emotionally get behind? And that was a complete game changer. And that allowed me to start, as I would look for other jobs, people would extend offers and I would say, thank you, but no thank you. I've interviewed you. You're not the right company for me. Like intellectually, yes, I could do the job. I could knock it out of the park, but I don't think I would enjoy working for you. And I don't think you would enjoy the way I work. Right. And I don't need you to change to make me happy any more than I'm going to change to make my, in some weird way, I'm going to make myself unhappy to change for you. Like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to make that sacrifice. And that was a major change. That's how I ended up in Central Washington. And with my wife is, again, you start understanding what's the most important things in your life. And I think, one of the biggest mistakes in my life, my 20s and my 30s, was pursuing my career at all costs without sort of putting it in context to sort of the greater purpose or intent of my life. I don't think it's a zero-sum game or a mutually exclusive game of, that you can't have a great career and also work with great people that are right for you. Again, right for you.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why I want to be really gentle with that statement. I think sometimes we take overly strong proclamations, especially in the news, the way we talk about companies. There are companies and places I know I would never want to work for, even some great companies. Like, for an example, Apple. I grew up with Apple. I'm almost 50 now. I've been programming since I was like 5, starting with Apple. So, and I always said I was going to work at Apple, love Apple, but like Apple is very much an in-person. You got to be hands-on. You got to be down with the Apple company, physically. And I don't want to move. I want to be, me and my wife, we do not want to locate to that. So I would probably never be able to work for Apple or Disney, for the example, because again, they want that, always on in-person kind of a setting. And that's not right for me. That doesn't make them a horrible company. Any more than like I worked at Amazon. Amazon's an amazing company with some amazing people, but I can tell you for a fact that I'm really not suited for their culture. And I know a lot of people who it's great for, and they love that culture. And, who am I to sort of turn to them and say, no, you're wrong.
Right.
Like,
right.
They should know what's best for themselves, even if I would say it's not best for me. So
yeah. Bad fit doesn't mean bad for all. Bad fit for me doesn't mean bad for all. But, Ward, thank you for, sharing both those stories. And, there's something you said earlier that I jotted down. It's a great phrase. And I think it maybe connects the two stories. It connects to a lot of the stories people have told here on the podcast. And I've come to understand better from having these conversations. I thought I knew something, and then I learned, right? The difference between, like, we think we know something versus being able to recognize it's really more of a hunch or an assumption or a hypothesis. Yes. And, I think back to even this connection to lean. Former Toyota people I've worked with, one of the things they'd love to ask is if you make some sort of statement, how do you know that? What do you know, and how do you know it? And I think it's really helpful to be able to distinguish knowledge, knowing something, versus an assumption. And sometimes assumptions are necessary, but I think when you test an assumption with that thought process of I could be wrong, I think that leads to better results instead of being stubborn or doubling down or refusing to be wrong, because we're going to be wrong, and let's learn from it.
If you think about what innovation is doing something that someone has not done before you. And to go a little bit off in the weeds, and I'll tie it back in, is I came up through probably a culture and to a belief of like in worship of the written word, right? Declarative knowledge. Someone else sat down, they gathered all the information together, they put it down in formula, you could read it, you could study off of it. And you'd go get a 4-year degree, and lo and behold, you were quote unquote. And I think you and I are maybe talked about this prior, but just because you have a 4-year degree doesn't make you an aerospace engineer, right? I have advanced degrees in aerospace engineering. What it meant though was I was qualified to go start at a company and become an aerospace engineer after another 10 or 15 years worth of experience.
Mm-hmm.
But we have sort of perverted what it actually means to acquire knowledge. And we have an overdependence on declarative knowledge, which is the knowledge written down, which is not innovative knowledge. Those are sort of quote unquote the knowns, when most of the work we do is actually innovative, which means it's procedural knowledge, which means it's knowledge acquired by doing, which means you're actually operating off assumptions and hypothesis all the time under the guise of, I don't know, but I will figure that out. And so you can get into this, I like to talk this fate or destiny, right? Your fate or your destiny is, your fate is predetermined by, the sister's fate, if you believe in that, or, like God has ordained for you if you want to go down that route. But the idea is that at some point, your fate has already been decided for you, versus destiny to me is the idea that I make for myself my future. And I would argue your fate and your destiny come from the same place, right? So if you look at I know and I don't know, you can create this little like 4x4, 2x2 grid, right? A quadrant, and you can come up with I know, which is the stuff you've already learned, either procedurally or declaratively. I don't know, which is the stuff that you intentionally didn't decide to go learn, right? Didn't take that class in accounting. And I don't know, it just oftentimes as we get older, as you know, you and I are probably about the same age, you start forgetting stuff, but it's very internalized to us. It's so deep in us, we don't even recognize that we have that as pattern recognition. But our destiny, our fate comes from that last box, and does the future of a company, if it's being innovative, trying to solve problems, is I don't know what I don't know, right? That box is actually disproportionately larger because that's the universe of actual existing possible knowledge out there, to which we only know maybe, let's say 1%, and I'm being very generous by saying 1%. It's probably like 0.00001%. So most of things that could be understood or known are actually in this box of I don't know. And so that is our ignorance, right? That's where our innovation comes from. So if you do not have a culture, if you are not set up personality wise to go, I just fundamentally normally don't know, then you will never truly be successful as an innovative leader, nor will you be able to create teams that are innovative. And that gets back to that celebration of errors, which is really about, which I took from Amazon, they call it a correction of errors. But the idea is, how do you create a mechanism to create a culture that's psychologically safe to make mistakes and learn? And that is what celebration errors is all about. Because fundamentally, what we're trying to do is just acknowledge, I don't know, but it's okay. Please go figure it out. Go make a ton of mistakes, because that's how you're going to learn. The mistakes are actually going to teach you. And then through those mistakes, you go on and find new interesting mistakes to make. And that is fundamentally at the core, that sort of flywheel of innovation comes from right. I don't know.
Yeah.
And then you trip, you fall, you pick yourself up, and you go, oh, now I know.
Yeah.
And then you do it all over again. You find another thing to go trip up over. And I think so much of us, the last thing that I learned, and I'll put this gently, when I was at my first company, Boeing, I met a lot of people. I was coming out of grad school at that point. I was like in my late 20s, coming into my early 30s. So I would meet people at their anniversaries at work, and they'd been there for like 30 years, which still to this day sort of blows my mind that someone would be at one company for longer than I had been alive at that point. It's amazing, right? It's an amazing testament. But what the other interesting thing I saw a lot with folks who used to be getting experts, and I don't think this is, I'm using an example from Boeing, but this isn't specific to Boeing. This is true of anyone, and this is something we should all aspire to avoid, is that they got very used to being experts in a single subject, and they got very brittle emotionally and intellectually around not knowing something. And so what they did is they tended to avoid things that they didn't know, and they focused on the things that they knew as experts. And I found that created a gap in their ability to grow and be innovative as engineers. And they tended to just retread the same space over right. and over again, in part because the culture did not promote, hey, it's okay to say you don't know.
Right.
Just go out and figure it out. And so that was another learning that, again, through people, I just realized I wanted to become an expert, but I also did not want to have my intellectual self, my curiosity be stamped out because my right. ego, that was my read on it. My ego would not allow me to sort of say, I don't know, because the culture wouldn't allow you to say, I don't
right.
know.
Right. Well,
you touched to know.
You touched on a couple important aspects of psychological safety in a workplace. And there's a book that I really love that I read this year, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. So first off, just go through it real quickly. I think you'd be interested
Yes, please.
in this. First off is inclusion safety. Do you feel accepted, valued as yourself? Like the one expression Tim Clark uses is it expensive to be yourself or not? So you've touched on this of environments where you feel fully accepted for the human being that you are, not the resource who's contributing whatever work. And then the second stage is learner safety, which includes, is it safe to say I made a mistake? Is it safe to say I don't know? Is it safe to try and learn something new? Like in pandemic times, I think this is a helpful exercise. Go force yourself to go take a class in something that you really don't know much about, to remember what it's like to be a new learner. I think that builds
empathy
for people that you're hopefully working with. So you have inclusion safety, learner safety, contributor safety. Are you safe to do work that makes a difference? Because that's a human need. And then the fourth level that's harder to get to is challenger safety. Is it safe to challenge the status quo? And that's where innovation comes from. And I think it's all connected. Like you said, if you have a culture where you're only allowed to do experiments that are going to succeed, that's not innovation. That's the primary objective, though, in a lot of workplaces is never be wrong. Don't have a hypothesis that doesn't play out. And like you could survive that way, but you're not really going to thrive.
Yeah. I mean, even if you argue 80% of what you should be doing is maybe more turn the crank kind of work, you still need some amount of innovation in that to keep on growing and evolving and changing to the times, right? Customers, we as consumers are inherently fickle, and, how we behave, and operate and what drives us today is going to be different, even in a span of a year or two. So companies who, know how to listen to their customers and use that as to drive their innovation will always succeed. And those who just keep on doing the same thing, at some point, they will be left behind. And, we can see lots of companies gone that way. And, that's part of the nature of companies. But yeah, I love the idea of like, hey, I get to first be myself, and I get to sort of acknowledge that myself am flawed, right? And the next piece is, even as a flawed person, I can contribute. And then as the final one is really the test is like, with all those things said, I can also come in and I can challenge. And that's as much a statement about like, what kind of leadership do you have, and the psychological safety of the leadership being okay to say, I don't know. And also being able to share in the sort of leading of the company. And that's an interesting, I think that 4 stage is a really deep one. That's actually probably the hardest for a lot of companies to get to, because it requires everyone at the company, top to bottom, to buy into psychological safety. Because I've definitely been in places where I can create a lot of safety for everyone around me, but maybe my peers don't agree with the psychological safety. So the moment I allow someone to challenge me, even though I might be comfortable with it, they see that my peers, my boss might see it as a weakness, as like, oh, Ward has, his team completely like undermining him, and they question him. So right. Why don't I even have Ward, right? Like, because they don't understand the value of psychological safety. So
there's misunderstandings or mistakes. People think psychological safety is the safety to not be challenged. Like, no. Creating the safety for people to challenge you. And if you're not a leader who wants to be challenged, then for one, don't promise people that you're going to have a culture of psychological safety. You don't promise people that this is a safe space. Like, no, like saying that doesn't make it happen. But that, I want to go back to, celebration of error, COE. I think you said something, Ward, that, I want to explore that all errors are not created equally. Like, would you equally celebrate the error that comes from the part of the work where you're just cranking out work versus an error that's made when you're trying to be innovative and doing something brand new? Or do you need to have a culture that celebrates all the errors, whether
it's a great question. I mean, obviously I prefer to see the more innovative, like, hey, we were really pushing ourselves over our skis. I always go back to like when I was learning to ski with my father, and I used to like complain that I would fall flat down in the snow and like how horrible of a skier. And he's like, no matter how good you are, if you don't fall down at least once or twice a day, you're probably doing it wrong, right? Like you're not pushing yourself. So like I want to see more of the, hey, we pushed ourselves in our edges caught. Like we really were pushing on the envelope of what we could do. But that said, like there's nothing wrong with it operationally. Like that can be a celebration too, because I want people to own their processes. What does lean teach us? It really advocates for pushing decision making down to the lowest level in the organization, is most informed by the decision. So celebration is there is also letting them know, hey, it's okay if you made mistakes. What I ask is like, there's a few things that we go through is like, I always ask my leaders, because they'll ask, should we celebrate everything? Or, like, because we actually write a COE for that. This is, look, at some point there's diminishing returns to writing everything up. So you should be really focused on, am I going to learn something from this? If you don't think as a leader, don't spend the time and energy to do the root cause analysis and look for the short-term and the long-term solutions going forward. And also make sure you follow through. That's the other thing is like, I don't want a bunch of COEs where we say, hey, we could do this in the future to avoid this mistake. No. If we're going to do a COE and we put a long-term fix in it, guess what? We are committing ourselves to actually following through. That's the other piece is I want to teach the follow through. And there's lots of things we do with COEs, but a lot of it is about ideally trying to make building better and better processes that protect us more and more, giving us more and more opportunity to spend on the edges. Like when I first showed up at RealSelf, with no disrespect to anyone, RealSelf when I joined, a lot of the mistakes that we discovered in production had been there for 3 or 4 years, 5 years. No one was paying attention. No one was looking. Nowadays we're down to about 15 minutes if something sits in production normally before we find out about it. Because over time, through the COEs, we've added better and better instrumentation, monitor, and learning. We know what to look for, and the teams know how to more proactively monitor those things, which has incidentally driven a lot more trust from the rest of the organization back into the technology org, that the technology org is taking care of things. Because the worst thing I always tell my teams is, I don't mind you making a mistake. I really don't like it when someone else from the other part of the organization, or worse, our customer tells us about the mistake, right? Like if you tell me about it, that's an okay thing. Otherwise, we should all look at it as go, hey, we failed our partners at the company because they had to tell us that we made a mistake in production, right? And then the worst one would be our customer coming back to us after a month and saying, hey, did you know you have a bug in your code? So again, I want people to have, like you said, being psychologically safe doesn't mean being challenged. It actually means being challenged and being okay with that. And it means being accountable without being fearful of the consequences of that. And so how do you build a culture around that accountability? Around the ability to communicate outwards and keep people informed. So we use COEs as a way of, on our weekly business reviews, we share out our COEs, and the rest of the organization uses COEs the same way as a broadcast mechanism. Like, hey, customer support, all those complaints you're getting about, yeah, engineering knows about it, and here's what we're doing about it. And we also have mechanisms, if that's truly the case, to escalate, so customer support doesn't wait till the next week to find out about this, because that oftentimes happens, right? Like something happens in the system, at least especially in software, where customer support is on the other end of the phone getting these people screaming at them, and they have no idea what's going on because they're not involved in the day-to-day, nuances of production releases. So it's really important for engineering to immediately go off to customer support and say, hey, all those calls, they're from us. We know about it, so you can tell customers we're aware of it. Thank you. And here's our ETA, or our ETC, when we're going to get this fixed, and we'll tell you once we get it fixed, right? So that makes customer support a really great ally in that case. Versus in other companies, if you don't do that, customer support starts to hate the engineers because the engineers keep on breaking stuff and not telling them, and they just end up being the poor souls on the end of the phone call getting yelled at, with no recourse, no way to communicate, no way to, so they never get to feel like heroes, which is a shame. So, it's how do you build that connective tissue in your organization? That's another reason why we do COEs formally. So should you do it? I think the underlying question I would sort of say is, I try not to prejudge COEs, right? I'm actually trying to maximize for learning, and I don't want to say, oh, your organization isn't at the edge of innovation, therefore I don't care if you make a mistake. No, I want you to improve your processes, and I want you to feel ownership over it and not be fearful that your process isn't working the way, because again, this is a deeper lean learning, right? One thing when I was working with Shingujutsu, I always talk about, it's always process over people. People don't make mistakes. Processes do, right? People don't show up to work and go, you know what? I'm going to have a really bad day today, and I'm going to ensure that something goes wrong.
Right.
Right. Yes, you can go find me an exception case, but like, let's not lose that as like that's an anecdote of one versus 99.999% of people actually do show up and care about the quality of their work.
Yeah. Right? Well, there's a difference between sabotage and errors, and I think sabotage is pretty rare.
Yeah, and that's another way to say this. Like what you're talking about is a sabotage. What we're talking about is human error, and the human error really drives from processes, communications, setting expectations. There's lots of things, but it's not the person themselves that made the mistake. So the COE is also meant to create that psychological safety. It's not you, it's us. Somehow we failed you, like as a team. So how do we as a team go ensure that this doesn't happen again? And hey, since it happened to you, could you also be a part of the process? Because you probably know best, like, oh yeah, that wording and that little line there was really confusing, or that link is old and it sent me off to an old, like, well, let's update. Sometimes there's super easy things, but again, if we don't enculturate people to go, just go fix it then people won't. They'll just go, well, that's someone else's job. No, it's all our jobs. Like if you're touching that, go fix it. And again, that's what Lean always teaches us, makes those decisions at the lowest level. Have the people on the line own the line. Right. And so COE is really just another means for exactly that sort of philosophical belief.
Yeah. So there's that philosophy. There are a lot of important mindsets here. And then there's the COE document. That, when you refer to writing these up, is there a template available on your website, or is the template even not as important as covering the main components as that Forbes article described?
I think the Forbes goes over the template. I'm happy to share out. It's super simple. It's actually sort of how you talk about it. And I even have like an hour long lunch and learn. I'm happy to share out links to that, or if anyone wants to, I'll come and talk to them about it. And because the format is again the vehicle for, but the top of it is an impact statement, and I use that actually to teach, especially more junior leaders, how to communicate more at an executive summary level. Can they write that in 3 to 5 sentences using quantitative data? How many customers were impacted? How long? When did it start? When did we observe it? How long was it in production? Was there a monetary impact? Right. So again, quantifying. And again, this can be really useful, especially amongst people who, I'll take engineers. Engineers tend to oftentimes are the most distant from a business acumen standpoint of understanding the impact to a line of code, to like impact to revenue, for an example, or cost. And so when they write that COE, they're like, oh, wow, that one line of code that, took down the site for 15 minutes, maybe cost the company, $5 million. And like, that's a lot of money, like that's a lot of responsibility that I have as an engineer now, versus they'll just go, if you just look at it as lines of code, they'll go, oh, it's just one line of code. It's like, yeah, it's one line of code that took down the site, and and that's okay at some level, but like, please don't distance yourself from that. Please understand and connect yourself to how important, how much impact you can have at this business, positive and negative. In this case, not so great, but like, let's use it as a learning, right? Like, let's use that as an investment in your education about like how important that one line of code is. And then you get into that's impact. So 3 to 5 sentences, really good to learn how to be succinct. And then what I do is I always put under the next section is resolutions, and I do short-term and long-term. I normally break it into short-term and long-term. Short-term is like put the fire out. Okay, we had a fire. That's the impact. Fire, the extent of the fire, how much damage. Then it's short-term resolutions. Here's what we did to put the fire out. Like, I don't know, we went and started the server back over. We got customers back getting their orders. Fundamentally, the error still exists, but at least we no longer have that issue out in production, or we roll back the code, or we fixed it. And then the long-term solution would be, okay, maybe it was just a simple bug fix. It might actually be something deeper. Like as you're getting through the root cause analysis, you might go, architecturally, we're set up incorrectly. And like, we have this massive set of major probability of this reoccurring. Okay, should we go re-architect that? And again, I get into like, please do not pontificate on the shoulds. Like either do it or don't do it. I don't want to hear about what we should do, because a lot of times engineers will use that as I pick on engineers. I deal with them a lot. I see this a lot. They'll use it as a parking lot to sort of gripe about like massive tech debt that no one's ever going to pay down. And it's like, okay, well, let's not talk about that, because it really doesn't engender anything helpful. I want you to be proactive about what you will do, not what you could do. Don't moralize the problem. be very much like proactive. And in the bottom of it is really the root cause, which a lot of people will go, well, COE is a root cause analysis. I go, no, the bottom section is your dumping ground for your root cause analysis. And that's when we get into the 5 whys. But I use that as homework. What I carry as an executive is the first 2 sections, impact and solutions. I look at the root cause largely to make sure that I have faith in those first 2 sections, but I almost don't need that 3rd section of like, what was the root cause as an executive. I use that again as a flyby. Like, did you actually dig into the code? Did you actually talk to other people? Do you really understand what you're proposing, or were you just trying to like slap this problem shut and go away? Which sometimes happens. So that's where I sort of, if I don't quite believe in the impact, or I don't quite feel like the solution is really getting at the root of it, I will look at the root cause, and that's sort of where I can interrogate the team's thinking there. So the format's pretty easy, and I try to keep it to 1 or 2 pages. Actually, the first 2 things should be 1 page.
Yeah. Well, and as it's described in that article, and again, that Forbes article that I'll link to, titled "Celebrating Errors Create Psychological Safety in the Workplace." And when you talk about impact, resolutions, root cause, it sounds like that's kind of the order of documenting it, where the thought process is thinking through the root cause so you know what the long-term resolution or the long-term countermeasure is. But like you said, that's where you show your work.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, the document's deductive. To your point, inductively, you would actually probably need to write the first piece, the bottom piece, the root cause first. Though I'd argue the impact actually does not need to be done with the root cause. And that's the one thing a lot of people trip up on is like, well, I haven't done the root cause analysis. Like, the patient's dead on the table. Like, you don't need to understand all the mistakes made. The patient's dead. Like, that is your 3 to 5 sentences, right? Like, I'm using an extreme example from Shinjuku when we were always talking about like the surgeon but it's sort of like there's a defect, there is a problem. Like, what is that defect? How big is it? Like, that has nothing to do with how you got there. That's just describing like, here is the outcome of that. And that's to inform people. And so that can be written normally within 24 hours of a defect or an issue being found, especially if it has material impact to the business that other people need to be aware of in short order. I would recommend no later than 24 hours from time where you sort of start writing the COE. And then that will, once you get that resolved, then go spend time doing the root cause. You probably, and very quickly in the same time, your short-term resolutions might also be written and done and executed in the same amount of time, right? Because a lot of times you're just trying to make the mistake go away. So put out the fire, short-term. Long-term is make sure this particular fire doesn't happen again. And I find that framework is very useful for people, because a lot of times they trying to solve it all, doing it all at once. It's like, no, just put the fire out. Okay, now that we got the fire out, and we inform people of the fire, we've bought ourselves a little bit more time to breathe and go, okay, what would we need to do to help us make sure this problem doesn't happen again? Or if we can't do that, in a lot of instances, especially in an engineering world, how do we monitor and alert for ourselves to make sure that if it does happen again, the mean time to response is faster, and or ensure that it's not a customer telling us, but it's our on-call person getting alerted at 2:00 in the morning if we think it's important enough. So I'll be looking for those kinds of things, like, okay, was this a manual detection? Okay, how do we automate the detection? Was this 7 hours from injection, or 7 days, or 7 months? How do we get it to like being 7 minutes or 7 seconds? Or better yet, how do we get it in unit testing before we even get it to production, so that we don't even really ever see it and it just becomes part of the course? So you're always trying to just improve things, even if you can't necessarily eliminate things. And so you can use a COE as a very good way to sort of gauge the health of your organization. And like I said, along the way, teach all these other things. But it's all rooted on psychological safety. You won't get the accountability. You won't get the communications. You won't get the growth if people don't feel safe. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
So they got to feel safe. We all have to feel safe.
We do.
Top leaders too. And
I was going to ask you one final question before we wrap up. Again, our guest has been Ward Vuillemot. You can find his website at wardvuillemot.com. You talk about the firefighting and the root cause analysis, and it's a visual joke because it was a cartoon that I created with somebody. I'll share it with you later, Ward. I'll put a link in the show notes. But it's a couple of firefighters. There's literally a burning house, and they're grabbing the hoses, And the one turns to the other with this piece of paper and says, well, hey, wait, have you started doing your A3 yet? So this is a very nerdy, lean Toyota production system, problem-solving kind of joke. But the point is a serious one. And so you got to put the fire out first.
Yeah.
And then we can think about defining the problem. Well, the problem is right in front of us, and we can do the root cause analysis once everyone's safely out of the building and the fire is no longer spreading.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, I love that. I love that. So
the other question I was going to ask, and it's kind of unfair to ask you this question, maybe like sort of on the way out, because this could be a whole 30-minute discussion in and of itself. But when you talk about the safety to be yourself and to be who you are, and you disclose on your website, you mentioned earlier that you are autistic. Is it ever a mistake to disclose something that personal with people you're working with?
I think it's only a mistake if you think it's a mistake. I mean, I'm personally of the opinion, every decision has a cost. There's nothing that's costless. So for me, sharing that I'm autistic, I'm sure there are people who don't want to work for me or work with me or don't want to hire me. The way I look at it is I'm okay with that, because it's more important for me to be true to myself than necessarily have that opportunity. Now, a different person might decide differently. Their calculus might be different. So, it's hard for me to sort of say, hey, do tell that, especially if it does mean that, hey, maybe that one opportunity, that job you really wanted, you're not going to get. I would argue it's not worth the job if it means I can't be my true self. But that's me. That was something that I learned. And so like, I'm always try to take the weak form of the opinion, which is like, for me, this is what I know. You can use that framework to make a different decision for yourself. I rarely will have a strong opinion, but I don't want to work in a world where people have to hide themselves, because I don't want to work in a world where I have to hide myself. And I think when we think about like inclusivity, as you talked about, even from COE, but I even think about like diversity and equity and inclusion. I think that's a part of, allowing people to come for as they are. And, I quip, but the T in CTO, people, what is it? Technology. And sometimes I say it's chief therapy officer, because so much of my job as a people leader is really helping other people become more comfortable, more integrated with themselves, which I find a little ironic because I am autistic, but probably because I've spent the last 40, 50 years trying to integrate with myself. I'm a pretty good observer of human behavior and at least have some ideas of helping people. But I do spend a lot of time like helping just people become more integrated versions of themselves. And that's important to me. That might not be important to everyone. And some people that might be like, oh my God, that would be my nightmare if I had to work in that environment. And that's great. Like there's lots of companies that aren't like that. You should go work for those. But if you come work for me, I told my, he's now head of Titan Caskets. But when I interviewed him from Amazon, I said, the last thing I said as we were ending the interview, I said, by the way, I will oftentimes tell you I love you. And if you're uncomfortable with that or uncomfortable with that telling your team, you probably shouldn't come work with me. So that was the thing that sort of cinched the deal. He wanted to come work with me because of that. And again, that's sort of like I am true to myself, and I want people to be true to themselves too. And, what more can we ask of anyone, I think? So. Yeah.
Well, Ward, we can't ask anything more of you today. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your experiences and your insights here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate it.
So again, we've been joined, Ward Vuillemot. Go check out his website, wardvuillemot.com, and a great article. At first, I almost made the mistake of attributing the authorship to Ward, but it was actually written by somebody else about the COE method. I'll link to this in the show notes. Celebrating errors creates psychological safety in the workplace. So Ward, thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again to Ward for being our guest today. For a link to that article about celebration of error and links to his company and a whole lot more, look in the show notes, or you can go to markgraban.com/mistake195. As always, I want to thank you for listening. I hope this podcast inspires you to reflect on your own mistakes, how you can learn from them or turn them into a positive. I've had listeners tell me they started being more open and honest about mistakes in their work. And they're trying to create a workplace culture where it's safe to speak up about problems, because that leads to more improvement and better business results. If you have feedback or a story to share, you can email me, myfavoritemistakepodcast@gmail.com. And again, our website is myfavoritemistakepodcast.com.